In his conversations with the Dalai Lama, psychologist Paul Ekman distinguished between different types of empathy and compassion. True empathy involves more than knowing what people feel. It also entails the ability to resonate with those feelings. For example, sociopaths may do an excellent job of reading a person's emotional vulnerabilities, but without the ability to resonate with the other person's feelings, knowledge of those feelings become a tool for predation, not connection. This casts light on a curious fact about emotionally immature people. In spite of not resonating empathically, they are often quite canny when it comes to reading other people's intentions and feelings. However, they don't use their understanding of people to foster emotional intimacy. Instead, their empathy operates at an instinctual or superficially sentimental level. You may feel sized up, but not felt for. Lack of resonant empathy suggests a lack of self-development. For parents to accurately imagine what their children are feeling, they need to have enough self-development to be aware of their own emotions. If they haven't developed their own emotional self-awareness, they can't resonate with how others, including their own children, might feel inside. Why there are so many emotionally immature parents. Many of my clients have shared stories that reflect the emotional immaturity of their parents. For me, this begs the question of what could have caused so much emotional underdevelopment in so many parents. Based on my observations and clinical experience, it seems likely that the parents of many of my clients were emotionally shut down as children. As my clients and I have explored their family histories, they've often recalled evidence of great unhappiness and tension in their parents' early lives. Substance abuse, abandonment, loss, abuse, or traumatic immigration experiences hover in the family background, suggesting an atmosphere of loss, pain, and disconnection. Many people have told me that although they felt discounted or abused, it was nothing compared to the stories their parents told about their own childhood misery. Often the relationship between a client's mother and maternal grandmother was conflictual and unsatisfying, even though that grandmother might have become a nurturing figure for the client. It seems that many of my clients' parents never had a supportive or emotionally intimate connection with their own parents, so they developed tough defenses to survive their own emotional loneliness early in life. It's also important to remember that old-school parenting, the upbringing my clients' parents experienced, was very much about children being seen but not heard. Physical punishment was not only acceptable, it was condoned, even in schools, as the way to make children responsible. For many parents, spare the rod and spoil the child was considered conventional wisdom. They weren't concerned about children's feelings. They saw parenting as being about teaching children how to behave. It wasn't until 1946 that Dr. Benjamin Spock, in the original version of his mega-seller, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, widely popularized the idea that children's feelings and individuality were important factors to consider, in addition to physical care and discipline. In the generations before this shift, parenting tended to focus on obedience as the gold standard of children's development, rather than thinking about supporting children's emotional security and individuality. In the following stories, you can see the passed-down effects of this old-school parenting on my clients. Ellie's story. Ellie, the oldest child in a large family, remembered her mother Trudy as a generous person but hard as a rock. Trudy was active at church and in the community and had a reputation as being kind and helpful. But when it came to empathy for her children's feelings, she was impervious. Ellie had frequent nightmares and depended on a favorite stuffed animal to soothe her. One night, when Ellie was about 11 years old, her mother suddenly took her comforting stuffed animal and said, "I'm giving this away. You're too old for this." When Ellie begged her mother not to, Trudy told her she was being ridiculous. Although Trudy took good care of Ellie physically, she had no feeling for Ellie's emotional attachment to a precious toy. Ellie was so deeply attached to a cat who had been in the family since she was a toddler. One day, when Ellie came home from school, Trudy announced that she had given the cat away because it had messed in the house. Ellie was devastated, but as Trudy told Ellie years later, "We didn't give a damn about your feelings. We just kept a roof over your heads." Sarah's story. Sarah, whose mother was emotionally inhibited and standoffish, had a very strict upbringing. She remembers that her mother always seemed to be holding herself back emotionally, as if behind a great wall. But Sarah cherishes a memory of a morning when her mother stood quietly by her bed, fondly watching Sarah sleep before waking her up. Sarah was already partly awake, but she didn't move so she could enjoy this moment of secret closeness with her mother. Once she was fully awake, the wall went back up and her mother kept a proper distance. Deeper effects of being emotionally shut down. Of course, emotionally immature parents were once children themselves, and as children they may have had to shut down many of their deepest feelings in order to be acceptable to their own parents. It's likely that Ellie's and Sarah's mothers also grew up with parental insensitivity toward their feelings. Many emotionally immature people were over-pruned early in life, growing up within a very limited range of acceptability. Their personalities are like stunted bonsai trees, trained to grow in unnatural shapes. Because they had to bend to fit their families, they were unable to develop fluidly into the integrated, natural people they might have become. It may be that many emotionally immature people weren't allowed to explore and express their feelings and thoughts enough to develop a strong sense of self and a mature individual identity. This made it hard for them to know themselves, limiting their ability to engage in emotional intimacy. If you don't have a basic sense of who you are as a person, you can't learn how to emotionally engage with other people at a deep level. This arrested self-development gives rise to additional, deeper personality weaknesses that are common among emotionally immature people, as outlined in this chapter. They are often inconsistent and contradictory. Instead of having a well-integrated sense of who they are, emotionally immature people are more like an amalgam of various borrowed parts, many of which don't go together well. Because they had to shut down important parts of themselves out of fear of their parents' reactions, their personalities formed in isolated clumps, like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit together. This explains their inconsistent reactions, which make them so difficult to understand. Because they probably weren't allowed to express and integrate their emotional experiences in childhood, these people grow up to be emotionally inconsistent adults. Their personalities are weakly structured, and they often express contradictory emotions and behaviors. They step in and out of emotional states, never noticing their inconsistency. When they become parents, these traits create emotional bafflement in their children. One woman described her mother's behavior as chaotic, flip-flopping in ways that made no sense. This inconsistency means that, as parents, emotionally immature people may either be loving or detached, depending on their mood. Their children feel fleeting moments of connection with them, but don't know when or under what conditions their parent might be emotionally available again. This sets up what behavioral psychologists call an intermittent reward situation, meaning that getting a reward for your efforts is possible but completely unpredictable. This creates a tenacious resolve to keep trying to get the reward, because once in a while these efforts do pay off. In this way, parental inconsistency can be the quality that binds children most closely to their parent, as they keep hoping to get that infrequent and elusive positive response. Growing up with an inconsistent parent is likely to undermine a child's sense of security, keeping the child on edge. Since a parent's response provides a child's emotional compass for self-worth, such children are also likely to believe that their parents' changing moods are somehow their fault. Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth's mother was emotionally unpredictable and kept her guessing. She always felt anxious when approaching her mother. Would her mother push her away, or would she be interested and engaged? Elizabeth told me, I had to read her moods constantly. If she seemed negative, I would keep my distance, but if she was in a good mood, I could talk to her. She had the power to make me happy, and I tried my best to win her approval. As a child, Elizabeth often worried that she had caused her mother's negative mood changes. Feeling responsible, Elizabeth came to the conclusion I must be flawed. Elizabeth wasn't a flawed child, but the only way she could make sense of her mother's moods was to think they resulted from something she did, or worse, something she was. They develop strong defenses that take the place of the self. Instead of learning about themselves and developing a strong, cohesive self in early childhood, emotionally immature people learned that certain feelings were bad and forbidden. They unconsciously developed defenses against experiencing many of their deeper feelings. As a result, energies that could have gone toward developing a full self were instead devoted to suppressing their natural instincts, resulting in a limited capacity for emotional intimacy. Not realizing the magnitude of their parents' developmental limitations, many children of emotionally immature people think there must be a genuine, fully developed person hiding inside the parent, a real self they could connect to if only their parent would let them. This is especially true if the parent was occasionally affectionate or attentive. As one woman told me, with my parents, I used to pick the good part of them I liked and pretend that was the real part. I would tell myself that this good part would eventually win out, but it never did take over. I also used to pretend that the hurtful parts of them weren't real, but now I realize it's all real. When people's defenses have become an integral part of their personality, they're as real as scar tissue in the body. It may not have belonged there originally, but once formed, it's enduring. These limitations become a major part of people's personalities. Whether they can ultimately become more authentic and emotionally available depends on their ability to self-reflect. People often wonder whether their parents can ever change. That depends on whether their parents are willing to self-reflect, which is the first step in any change. Unfortunately, if their parents aren't interested in noticing their impacts on others, they have no impetus to look at themselves. Without such self-reflection, there's no way to change. Hannah's story. Hannah had always longed for a more intimate relationship with her stern, hard-working mother. As an adult, on one visit she asked her mother to tell her something about herself that she'd never shared with Hannah before. This caught her mother off guard. First she looked like a deer in headlights, then she burst into tears and couldn't speak. Hannah felt that she had simultaneously terrified and overwhelmed her mother with this innocent inquiry. She had unwittingly gone straight through her mother's defenses to a long-hidden place of sorrow, exposing her mother's unmet childhood longing to be heard by someone who was interested in her experience. Hannah's interest and empathy overwhelmed the defenses her mother had developed in response to the lack of that kind of connection. She simply couldn't deal with Hannah's attempt at emotional intimacy. Incomplete development leads to emotional limitations. Despite being highly emotionally reactive, emotionally immature people have a paradoxical relationship with emotions. They're quick to get emotionally aroused, but they're scared of their most authentic feelings. This is to be expected if they were raised in a family milieu that didn't help them deal with their emotions, or that may even have punished them for being upset. The sooner they can avoid their feelings or get over them, the better. They find the world of deep emotions extremely threatening. They fear feelings. As children, many emotionally immature people grew up in homes where they were taught that the spontaneous expression of certain feelings was a shameful breach of family custom. They learned that expressing, or even experiencing, these deeper feelings could bring shame or punishment, resulting in what psychotherapist researcher Lee McCullough and her colleagues have called affect phobia. Having learned to link their most personal emotions with judgments about being bad, they could no longer stand to acknowledge certain feelings, especially those related to emotional intimacy. As a result, they anxiously sought to inhibit their genuine reactions, developing defensive behaviors instead of experiencing their true feelings and impulses. Affect phobia can lead to an inflexible, narrow personality based on rigid defenses against certain feelings. As adults, these emotionally immature people have an automatic anxiety reaction when it comes to deep emotional connection. Most genuine emotion makes them feel exposed and extremely nervous. Throughout life, their energy has been devoted to creating a defensive facade that protects them from emotional vulnerability with other people. To avoid dangerous emotional intimacy, they stick to a well-worn life script and resist talking about or processing emotions, including in relationships. As parents, they pass down this fear of vulnerable emotions to their children. In such families, the saying, "I'll give you something to cry about," is a common parental response to an upset child. Many children of emotionally phobic parents develop the fear that if they start crying, they'll never stop, which arises because they were never allowed to find out that crying naturally stops on its own when allowed its full expression. Because they grew up with emotionally phobic parents who stepped in to squelch their distress, they never experienced the natural rhythm of a crying episode and how it winds down. It's easy to see how children growing up under these conditions could become fearful of their own emotions. In fact, even positive feelings of joy and excitement can become associated with anxiety. For example, Anthony recalled a painful incident when he joyfully raced out the front door to greet his father as he pulled up in the driveway. Anthony leaped over a small bush, swiped it with his foot, and knocked it over. Instead of appreciating Anthony's display of affection, his father gave him a beating. As a result, Anthony learned not only to be afraid of his father, but to fear spontaneous joy as something that would get him in trouble. They focus on the physical instead of the emotional. Emotionally immature parents can do a good job of taking care of their child's physical and material needs. In the world of food, shelter, and education, these parents may be able to provide everything that's needed. In terms of things that are physical, tangible, or activity-related, many of these parents make sure their children get every advantage they can afford. but when it comes to emotional matters, they can be oblivious to their children's needs. Many of my clients have good memories of being well cared for when ill, enjoying their parents' attention and even receiving presents and favorite foods, but this happened only after their parents were duly convinced they were really sick. They experienced this attentiveness when they were sick as proof of their parents' love. It seemed to be the one time when they remembered receiving lots of attention. This makes sense because caretaking during illness would allow a parent the justification to indulge a child with attention and affection. It stands to reason that affectionate caretaking felt safe to these parents when done for the purpose of restoring the child's physical health. Physical aid was more sanctioned than emotional attachment. Being well cared for in non-emotional areas can create confusion in people who grow up feeling emotionally lonely. They have overwhelming physical evidence that their parents loved and sacrificed for them, but they feel a painful lack of emotional security and closeness with their parents. They can be killjoys. Fear of genuine emotion can cause emotionally immature people to be killjoys. As parents, instead of enjoying their children's excitement and enthusiasm, they may abruptly change the subject or warn them not to get their hopes up. In response to their child's exuberance, they're likely to say something dismissive or skeptical to bring it down a notch. When one woman told her mother about her excitement about buying her first house, her mother actually said yes, and then you'll find something else to go on about. They have intense but shallow emotions. Emotionally immature people are easily overwhelmed by deep emotion, and they display their uneasiness by transmuting it into quick reactivity. Instead of feeling things deeply, they react superficially. They may be emotionally excitable and show a strong sentimentality, perhaps being easily moved to tears, or they may puff up in anger toward anything they dislike. Their reactivity may seem to indicate that they're passionate and deeply emotional, but their emotional expression often has a glancing quality, almost like a stone skipping the surface rather than going into the depths. It's a fleeting reaction of the moment, dramatic but not deep. When interacting with such people, the weirdly shallow quality of their emotions may leave you feeling unmoved by their distress. You might tell yourself you should be feeling more for them, but your heart can't resonate with their exaggerated reactions. And because they overreact so frequently, you may quickly learn to tune them out for the sake of your own emotional survival. They don't experience mixed emotions. The ability to feel mixed emotions is a sign of maturity. If people can blend contradictory emotions together, such as happiness with guilt or anger with love, it shows that they can encompass life's emotional complexity. Experienced together, opposed feelings tame each other. Once people develop the ability to feel different emotions at the same time, the world ripens into something richer and deeper. Instead of having a single, intense, one-dimensional emotional reaction, they can experience several different feelings that reflect the nuances of the situation. However, the reactions of emotionally immature people tend to be black and white, with no gray areas. This rules out ambivalence, dilemmas, and other emotionally complicated experiences. Differences in quality of thought. In addition to emotional and behavioral differences, there are often intellectual differences between emotionally mature and immature people. If your parents grew up in a family atmosphere that was full of anxiety and judgment, they may have learned to think narrowly and resist complexity. Excessive childhood anxiety leads not only to emotional immaturity, but also to oversimplified thinking that cannot hold opposing ideas in mind. Repressive or punitive family environments typically don't encourage free thinking or self-expression, and therefore aren't conducive to fully developing one's mind. Difficulties with conceptual thinking. Starting in adolescence, children begin to think conceptually, enabling them to solve problems with logic and reasoning instead of knee-jerk impulses. Accelerated brain development means they become both more objective and more imaginative. They can group ideas in categories and quickly think in symbols. They go beyond simply memorizing things and start to evaluate ideas, not just compare facts. They are able to think independently and hypothetically, and to generate new insights from previous knowledge. As children enter their teen years, their ability to self-reflect skyrockets because they become able to think about their own thinking. However, the intense emotions and anxiety that emotionally immature people experience can decrease their ability to think at this higher level. Since they are often at the mercy of their emotions, their higher thinking can easily fall apart under stress. In fact, their frequent lack of self-reflection comes from this tendency to regress and temporarily lose their ability to think about their thinking. When emotion-inducing topics come up, their minds fall into rigid black or white thinking that rejects complexity and precludes any cross-pollination of ideas. Emotionally immature people who are otherwise intelligent can think conceptually and show insight as long as they don't feel too threatened in the moment. Their intellectual objectivity is limited to topics that aren't emotionally arousing to them. This can be puzzling to their children, who experience two very different sides to their parents, sometimes intelligent and insightful, other times narrow-minded and impossible to reason with. Proneness to literal thinking. If you listen to the conversations of emotionally immature people, you may notice how routine and literal their thinking is. They tend to talk about what happened or what they observed, not the world of feelings or ideas. For example, one man found his mother's phone conversations draining and boring because she never talked about anything substantive. Instead, she only asked him mundane questions, like what he was doing at the moment or what the weather was like. He told me, she just reports the facts and never talks about anything other than, here's what happened lately. She doesn't connect with me in the conversation. I get so frustrated and want to say, can't we talk about something meaningful? But she can't. Intellectualizing obsessively. Another cognitive sign of emotional immaturity is over-intellectualizing and getting obsessed about certain topics. In those areas, emotionally immature people can conceptualize well, indeed excessively, but they don't apply that ability to self-reflection or being emotionally sensitive toward others. Their preoccupation with ideas distracts them from emotional intimacy. They may discuss their favorite topics at length, but they don't really engage the other person. As a result, they can be as hard to talk to as overly literal thinkers. Although they can think conceptually while communicating their ideas, they're only comfortable if things stay on an impersonal and intellectual level. Summary. Emotional immaturity is a real phenomenon that has been studied and written about for a long time. It undermines people's ability to deal with stress and to be emotionally intimate with others. Emotionally immature people often grew up in a family environment that curtailed their full emotional and intellectual development. As a result, they have an oversimplified approach to life, narrowing situations down to fit their rigid coping skills. Having such a limited sense of self makes them egocentric and undermines their ability to be sensitive to other people's needs and feelings. Their reactive emotions, lack of objectivity, and fear of emotional intimacy can make close relationships difficult, especially when it comes to their children. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at what it feels like to have a relationship with an emotionally immature parent, along with the challenges adult children face in trying to communicate with such parents. Chapter 3. How it feels to have a relationship with an emotionally immature parent. In this chapter, I'll explore how emotionally immature parents handle relationships in ways that frustrate their children's emotional needs. As you probably already know, being raised by such a parent feels both lonely and exasperating. We don't get a vote on our earliest relationships in life. Our strongest bond is to our primary attachment parent, the one we turn to first if scared, hungry, tired, or ill. We may seek out others for play when we're feeling good, but stress or an urgent need will send us scampering back to that principal caretaker. The intensity of this early bond helps explain why emotionally immature parents can be so endlessly disappointing. Relationships with them can be hard to deal with, but when we are distant or separated from them, it feels like something essential is missing. Our earliest instincts prompt us to keep turning to our parents for care and understanding. Exercise. Assessing your childhood difficulties with an emotionally immature parent. Emotional immaturity shows itself most clearly in relationships, and its impacts are especially profound when the relationship is between a parent and child. Read through the following statements, which outline some of the most painful difficulties emotionally immature parents cause for their children, and check off all that reflect your childhood experience. If you'd like to fill out the assessment for more than one parent or step-parent, use the downloadable version of this exercise available at website. See the back of the book for instructions on how to access it. I didn't feel listened to. I rarely received my parents' full attention. My parents' moods affected the whole household. My parent wasn't sensitive to my feelings. I felt like I should have known what my parent wanted without being told. I felt like I could never do enough to make my parent happy. I was trying harder to understand my parent than my parent was trying to understand me. Open, honest communication with my parent was difficult or impossible. My parent thought people should play their roles and not deviate from them. My parent was often intrusive or disrespectful of my privacy. I always felt that my parent thought I was too sensitive and emotional. My parent played favorites in terms of who got the most attention. My parent stopped listening when he or she didn't like what was being said. I often felt guilty, stupid, bad, or ashamed around my parent. My parent rarely apologized or tried to improve the situation when there was a problem between us. I often felt pent-up anger toward my parent that I couldn't express. Each of these statements is linked to characteristics described in this chapter. Your parent may not have all the characteristics I describe, but checking off more than one of the items suggests some level of emotional immaturity. Communication is difficult or impossible. If you've been trying to relate to an emotionally immature parent with poor intimacy skills, these interactions may have made you feel shut down, shut up, or shut out. Even if your parent is at the nicer, warmer end of the spectrum, he or she probably has a very narrow window of attention regarding other people's interests. You may have tried for years to find a way to connect, only to come away feeling invisible and unheard time and again. You've probably felt plenty of exasperation. Your parent's insensitivity guarantees it. As one person said about her self-preoccupied mother, she thinks we are so close, but for me it's not a satisfying relationship. It makes me crazy when she tells people that I'm her best friend. Communication with emotionally immature people usually feels one-sided. They aren't interested in reciprocal mutual conversations. Like young children, they crave exclusive attention and want everyone to be interested in what they find engaging. If other people are getting more attention, they find ways to draw attention back to themselves, such as interrupting, firing off zingers that get everybody's attention, or changing the subject. If all else fails, they may pointedly withdraw, look bored, or otherwise communicate that they're disengaged, behaviors that ensure the focus stays on them. Brenda's story. Brenda's elderly mother, Mildred, had always been very self-centered. After Mildred visited her over the holidays, Brenda was exhausted. At our next session, Brenda looked spent and physically older. During that session, she offered this description of her mother. My mother is only interested in herself. She never asks me how I'm feeling or how work is going. She only wants to know what I'm doing so she can brag about me to her friends. I don't think she's ever really taken in anything I've said to her. It just doesn't register. We've never had a real relationship because the attention was always on her. She's never filled up my emotional tank. She doesn't care if I'm really happy, and she's very dismissive of whatever I say. Having her around is nothing but work for me. It's like dealing with this superficial person who just wants me to do things for her. I don't know how she has the nerve to be so demanding. Although Mildred was in her 80s, her egocentrism was childlike. Brenda understood her mother's immaturity at an intellectual level, but still found herself getting angry with her. As she told me, I wish she didn't get under my skin so easily. I'm disappointed at how angry I get when I'm around her. During Mildred's visit, Brenda repeatedly tried to get her settled so she could get a few things done for the holidays. But within minutes, Mildred would be calling out to her, expecting Brenda to drop everything and bring her something. It was annoying to be repeatedly interrupted, but Brenda's strong reaction went deeper than that. The following section on emotional attachment helps explain Brenda's anger. They provoke anger. John Bowlby, a pioneer in studying children's reactions to separation and loss, observed that babies and children get angry as a normal response to being left by their parents. Sadness is an expected response to loss, but Bowlby documented that anger is also common in response to separation. This is understandable. Anger and even rage are adaptive reactions to feelings of abandonment, giving us energy to protest and change unhealthy emotional situations. In this light, Brenda's anger at her mother wasn't petty or irrational. It was her biological response to feelings of helplessness caused by her mother's emotional disregard. After all, feeling dismissed or unseen creates an emotional separation. For Brenda, it was as if her mother had repeatedly walked out on her. When Brenda understood that her mother's self-centeredness was a kind of emotional abandonment, she could comprehend the depths of her anger for the first time. She wasn't overreacting. She was having a normal response to an emotional injury. And once Brenda understood where her anger was coming from, she could see herself in a different light. She had been a normal child. She had experienced the anger that any child would feel if a parent walked out or refused to respond. Sometimes children of emotionally immature parents repress their anger or turn it against themselves. Perhaps they've learned that it's too dangerous to express anger directly, or maybe they feel too guilty about their anger to be aware of it. When anger is internalized in this way, people tend to criticize and blame themselves unrealistically. They may end up severely depressed or even have suicidal feelings, the ultimate expression of anger against the self. Alternatively, some people express their anger in a passive-aggressive way, attempting to defeat their parents and other authority figures with behaviors like forgetting, lying, delaying, or avoiding. They communicate by emotional contagion. Because emotionally immature people have little awareness of feelings and a limited vocabulary for emotional experiences, they usually act out their emotional needs instead of talking about them. They use a method of communication known as emotional contagion, which gets other people to feel what they're feeling. Emotional contagion is also how babies and little children communicate their needs. They cry and fuss until their caretakers figure out what's wrong and fix it. Emotional contagion from an upset baby to a concerned adult is galvanizing, motivating a caretaker to do anything necessary to calm the child. Emotionally immature adults communicate feelings in this same primitive way. As parents, when they're distressed, they upset their children and everyone around them, typically with the result that others are willing to do anything to make them feel better. In this role reversal, the child catches the contagion of the parent's distress and feels responsible for making the parent feel better. However, if the upset parent isn't trying to understand his or her own feelings, nothing ever gets resolved. Instead, the upsetting feelings just get spread around to others so that everyone reacts without understanding what is truly the matter. They don't do emotional work. Emotionally immature parents don't try to understand the emotional experiences of other people, including their own children. If accused of being insensitive to the needs or feelings of others, they become defensive, saying something along the lines of, "Well, you should have said so." They might add something about not being a mind reader, or they might dismiss the situation by saying the hurt person is overly emotional or too sensitive. However they respond, the message is the same. They can't be expected to make the effort to understand what's going on inside other people. In her article, Toiling in the Field of Emotion, psychiatrist Harriet Fradd uses the term emotional labor to describe this effort to understand others. Emotional labor is the expenditure of time, effort, and energy, utilizing brain and muscle to understand and fulfill emotional needs. By emotional needs, I mean the human needs for feeling wanted, appreciated, loved, and cared for. Individuals' emotional needs are often unspoken or unknown, unconscious. Emotional labor often occurs together with physical labor, producing goods or services, but emotional labor differs from physical labor by aiming to produce the specific feelings of being wanted, appreciated, loved, and/or cared for. She goes on to explain that some people don't always realize they need emotional comforting, since emotional needs are often vague or subconscious. Other people might hide their need because they're ashamed to admit it, so helpers must offer comfort tactfully and obliquely, allowing the person to save face. Emotional labor is hard work. People doing this work must also keep reading the other person to know if their efforts are effective. Many roles and occupations depend heavily on emotional labor, and if it's done well, others hardly notice the effort involved. Good mothering is an example of this unsung labor, as are any number of service industry professions. Mature people take on the emotional work in relationships automatically because they live in a state of empathy and self-awareness. It's impossible for them to overlook the fact that someone they care about is having a hard time. Doing this work allows them to successfully navigate all kinds of interpersonal situations without stepping on other people's toes. Both at work and at home, emotional labor promotes goodwill and good relationships. Emotionally immature people, on the other hand, often take pride in their lack of this skill. They rationalize their impulsive and insensitive responses with excuses like, "I'm just saying what I think," or "I can't change who I am." If you confront them with the fact that not saying everything you think is a sign of good sense, or that people can't mature without changing who they are, they will probably respond with anger or by dismissing you as ridiculous. It's as though they think they're off the hook if others don't spell out their pain or difficulty in words. They believe that they aren't required to be tuned into others' feelings. However, emotionally mature people are almost always sensitive to others, knowing this is simply part of having good relationships. For people who have empathy, emotional work flows easily. However, for those who are unskilled at empathy and find other people's minds to be opaque, emotional work doesn't feel natural at all. This may be one reason why emotionally immature people complain so much when others expect them to make the effort. They are hard to give to. Emotionally immature people crave attention to their needs, yet they're actually hard to give to. This trait has been called poor receptive capacity by researcher Lee McCullough. Emotionally immature people want others to show concern about their problems, but they aren't likely to accept helpful suggestions. They reflexively reject efforts to make them feel cared about. They pull others in, but when people try to help, they push them away. In addition, these people seem to expect others to read their minds and are often quick to anger if people don't anticipate their wishes fast enough. They dislike having to tell people what they need and instead hold back, waiting to see whether anyone will notice how they're feeling. The classic unspoken demand of the emotionally immature adult is, if you really loved me, you'd know what I want you to do. As an example, one woman described her mother's habit of sitting in the den and waiting until a family member came back from the kitchen to complain angrily that the person hadn't thought to ask her if she wanted anything. Instead of speaking up about what they need, emotionally immature people create a malignant guessing game that keeps everybody uneasy. They resist repairing relationships. Problems are bound to come up in any relationship, so it's important to know how to handle conflict in ways that help the relationship weather the storm. It takes confidence and maturity to admit to being wrong and try to make things better, but emotionally immature people resist facing their mistakes. People who have been wronged by an emotionally immature person may start to think they're at fault if they continue to feel hurt by what the person did. Emotionally immature people expect you to take them off the hook immediately. If it feels better to blame you for not forgiving them fast enough, that's what they'll do. After a rift, many people will make what relationship expert John Gottman calls a repair attempt, apologizing, asking for forgiveness, or making amends in a way that shows a desire to patch things up. But emotionally immature people have a completely unrealistic idea of what forgiveness means. To them, forgiveness should make it like the rift never happened, as though a completely fresh start is possible. They have no awareness of the need for emotional processing or the amount of time it may take to rebuild trust after a major betrayal. They just want things to be normal again. Others' pain is the only fly in the ointment. Everything would be fine if others would just get past their feelings about the situation. They demand mirroring. Mirroring is a form of empathy and relatedness that mature parents spontaneously give to their children. Sensitive and emotionally responsive parents mirror their children's feelings by showing those same emotions on their faces. They look concerned when their children are sad and display enthusiasm when their children are happy. In this way, sensitive parents teach their children about emotions and how to engage spontaneously with others. Good mirroring from a parent also gives a child the feeling of being known and understood as a unique individual. This isn't the case for the children of emotionally immature parents. As one man said regarding his mother, "She doesn't see me for who I am. She will never know me, even though I'm her own child." In fact, emotionally immature parents expect their children to know and mirror them. They can get highly upset if their children don't act the way they want them to. Their fragile self-esteem rides on things going their way every time. However, no child is psychologically capable of mirroring an adult accurately. Emotionally immature parents often have the fantasy that their babies will make them feel good about themselves. When their children turn out to have their own needs, it can send such parents into a state of intense anxiety. Those who are extremely emotionally immature may then use punishment, threats of abandonment, and shaming as trump cards in an attempt to feel in control and bolster their self-esteem at their children's expense. Cynthia's story. Cynthia's mother, Stella, who was extremely volatile, expected Cynthia to mirror her every mood, like an emotional clone. When Cynthia decided to travel as a young adult, Stella exploded, yelling, "You're disowned," and broke off all contact with Cynthia. She didn't talk to Cynthia for months, not even on her birthday. Cynthia summed up her mother's message as, "You wanted to be on your own. You left me. I don't want anything to do with you." After another episode of rage, sparked by Cynthia's plan to visit a friend in Canada, Stella cut off Cynthia's college funds. She told Cynthia that she was selfish for wanting to travel, saying, "What's the matter with you? Life isn't about having fun." Stella could only feel safe if Cynthia mirrored the same kind of narrow life she'd had. Fortunately, Cynthia had a strong personality. She put herself through college and became a flight attendant, traveling to exotic locations. But in the back of her mind, she still had the belief that if she wanted to keep any relationship, she had to appease and mirror the other person. She told me that she always feared people would react as her mother did, punishing her for daring to be different from them. Their self-esteem rides on your compliance. People who are emotionally immature only feel good about themselves when they can get other people to give them what they want and to act like they think they should. Given this shaky self-worth, it's hard for emotionally immature parents to tolerate their children's emotions. An upset or fussy child can stir up their anxieties about their own fundamental goodness. If they can't immediately calm their child, they may feel like a failure and then blame the child for upsetting them. For instance, Jeff remembered an incident from childhood when he asked his father for help with homework. When Jeff didn't understand the lesson immediately, his father yelled, "How goddamn stupid can you be? Stop being so lazy. You just don't try." Not surprisingly, Jeff was mortified and didn't ask for help again. What he couldn't understand as a child was that his father was fighting his own terror of being an incompetent father. If he failed to help his son understand easily and immediately, his reaction wasn't about Jeff at all. For emotionally immature people, all interactions boil down to the question of whether they're good people or bad ones, which explains their extreme defensiveness if you try to talk to them about something they did. They often respond to even mild complaints about their behavior with an extreme statement like, "Well then, I must be the worst mother ever," or "Obviously I can't do anything right." They would rather shut down communication than hear something that could make them feel like bad people. They see roles as sacred. If there's anything emotionally immature people are keen on in relationships, it's role compliance. Roles simplify life and make decisions clear-cut. As parents, emotionally immature people need their children to play a proper role that includes respecting and obeying them. They often use platitudes to support the authority of their role as a parent because, like roles, platitudes oversimplify complex situations and make them easier to deal with. Role entitlement. Role entitlement is an attitude of demanding certain treatment because of your social role. When parents feel entitled to do what they want simply because they're in the role of parent, this is a form of role entitlement. They act as though being a parent exempts them from respecting boundaries or being considerate. Marty's parents provide a classic example of role entitlement. Marty and her husband moved to a different city after Marty's husband was transferred. Not long afterward, Marty's parents moved nearby. Once in the neighborhood, her parents began stopping by unannounced and even walked into her house without knocking. When Marty suggested that they call first, her parents were indignant and cited their roles as parents to claim their right to drop in any time. Here's another example. Faith had to ban visits from her mother, a real estate agent, because she insisted on making changes to the furniture and accessories in Faith's house. Even after Faith told her mother to stop, she protested that she should be allowed to do it because she was Faith's mother and a realtor, two key roles for her. Role coercion. Role coercion occurs when people insist that someone live out a role because they want them to. As parents, they try to force their children into acting a certain way by not speaking to them, threatening to reject them, or getting other family members to gang up against them. Role coercion often involves a heavy dose of shame and guilt, such as telling a child that he or she is a bad person for wanting something the parent disapproves of. My client Jillian, whose family was rigidly religious, experienced a malignant case of role coercion. Jillian married an abusive man who physically injured her numerous times. She finally found the courage to leave him, only to have her mother insist that she return to her husband. Desperate for her mother's support, Jillian finally told her mother about the abuse, but in her mother's eyes, that was beside the point. Jillian now held the role of a married woman, and divorce was a sin. In another example, when Mason told his mother he thought he might be gay, she said he couldn't be because you are not a zebra. In her mind, the role of her son was firmly heterosexual, and if her son didn't see himself that way, he was as deluded as if he were claiming he was a different species. Insistence on complying with roles to this degree is a profound invalidation of a child's most personal and essential choices in life. Yet emotionally immature parents have no qualms about doing it because they aren't comfortable with complexity and prefer life simplified. In their view, not fulfilling a supposed role means something is wrong with the person and the person needs to change. They seek enmeshment, not emotional intimacy. Although emotional intimacy and enmeshment can look superficially similar, these two styles of interaction are very different. In emotional intimacy, two individuals with fully articulated selves enjoy getting to know each other at a deep level, building emotional trust through mutual acceptance. In the process of getting to know each other, they discover and even cherish differences between them. Emotional intimacy is invigorating and energizes people toward personal growth as they enjoy the interest and support of another person. In enmeshment, on the other hand, two emotionally immature people seek their identity and self-completion through an intense, dependent relationship. Through this enmeshed relationship, they create a sense of certainty, predictability, and security that relies on the reassuring familiarity of each person playing a comfortable role for the other. If one person tries to step out of the implicit bounds of the relationship, the other often experiences great anxiety that's only eased by a return to the prescribed role. Playing favorites. Enmeshment sometimes manifests as playing favorites. It can be hard to watch your parent give attention to a preferred sibling, making you wonder why your parent never showed that kind of interest in you. But obvious favoritism isn't a sign of a close relationship. It's a sign of enmeshment. It's likely that the preferred sibling has a psychological maturity level similar to your parents. Low levels of emotional maturity pull people into mutual enmeshment, especially if they are parent and child. Remember, emotionally immature parents relate on the basis of roles, not individuality. If you had an independent, self-reliant personality, your parent wouldn't have seen you as a needy child for whom he or she could play the role of rescuing parent. Instead, you may have been pegged as the child without needs, the little grown-up. It wasn't some sort of insufficiency in you that made your parent pay more attention to your sibling. Rather, it's likely that you weren't dependent enough to trigger your parents' enmeshment instincts. Interestingly, self-sufficient children who don't spur their parents to become enmeshed are often left alone to create a more independent and self-determined life. Therefore, they can achieve a level of self-development exceeding that of their parents. In this way, not getting attention can actually pay off in the long run, but in the meantime, high-functioning children still have the pain of feeling left out as their parent pours energy into emotional enmeshment with one or more siblings. Enmeshment can take the form of either dependency or idealization. In dependent enmeshment, the child is maladjusted and the parent plays the role of either rescuer or victim. In idealized enmeshment, the parent indulges a favorite child as though that child is more important and deserving than the other kids. However, this traps the idealized favorite child in an ironclad role, so that child isn't experiencing any true emotional intimacy either. Heather's story. Heather had always longed for her mother's interest and attention but had never received it, while her eldest sister, Marlo, was the clear favorite. Heather was particularly hurt when her mother enthusiastically reported how, on a recent visit, she and Marlo had just talked and talked and talked. About what, Heather asked. Oh, just what she was doing and what she wants to do. Heather's heart felt pierced because she had always wished for those kinds of conversations with her mother, but it had never happened. Another time, at a holiday gathering, Heather watched with dismay as her mother fluttered around Marlo with an adoring look and volunteered to sit on an uncomfortable chair so Marlo could have a nice seat. Mark's story. Mark's father, Don, clearly preferred Mark's younger brother, Brett, helping him financially and calling him his baby. When Mark's father died, at the funeral, Mark's uncle remembered how hard Don had been on Mark, punishing him harshly for no good reason. You were the best one, his uncle told him. I couldn't understand why he was so tough on you. Mark was an independent, intelligent child who was never dependent on his father. They couldn't enmesh, so Don turned to Brett, who was more emotionally immature. Finding substitute family members. Emotionally immature parents can act out their need for enmeshment even with people who aren't close family members. If there's an enmeshment void, they'll go outside the immediate family to fill it. They might also become enmeshed with a group, such as a church or other organization. Bill's story. After Bill was grown and out of the house, his parents started taking in homeless people they met through a church outreach program. At any get-together, Bill's parents would regale people with stories about the latest in the lives of the people they were helping. Although Bill's parents were very invested in talking about the latest person they had taken under their wings, they rarely mentioned anything Bill was involved in. They have an inconsistent sense of time. Although this is an extremely subtle point and easily overlooked, emotionally immature people often have a fragmented orientation to time, especially when they get emotional. We might assume that all adults experience time in the same way. using a kind of linear continuum that stretches seamlessly from the distant past into the foreseeable future. Not so with emotionally immature people. When they get emotionally aroused, moments exist in a kind of eternal now. This is one reason why the lives of emotionally immature people are often beset with problems. They don't see them coming. Ruled by desires of the moment, their experiences in time are frequently disconnected. When acting on their impulses, they don't use the past for guidance and they don't anticipate the future. This disturbance in time continuity explains their inconsistencies and their unreflective way they handle relationship issues. Why a poor sense of time can look like emotional manipulation. Emotionally immature people may seem to be emotional manipulators, but actually they're just very opportunistic tacticians, pressing for whatever feels best at the time. They have no investment in being consistent, so they say whatever gives them an edge in the moment. They may be capable of strategic thinking in their work or in other pursuits, but when it comes to emotional situations, they go for the immediate advantage. Lying is a perfect example of a momentary win that feels good but is destructive to a relationship in the long run. How lacking a sense of time's continuity creates inconsistency. When stressed or emotionally aroused, immature people don't experience themselves as being embedded in the ongoing flow of time. They experience moments in time as separate, non-linear blips, like little lights randomly going on and off, with few linkages in time between one interaction and another. They act inconsistently as their consciousness hops from one experience to another. This is one reason why they're often indignant when you remind them of their past behavior. For them, the past is gone and has nothing to do with the present. Likewise, if you express caution about something in the future, they're likely to brush you off since the future isn't here yet. More emotionally mature people, on the other hand, experience time as a series of connected, self-aware moments. If they regret something they did, it continues to travel through time with them, attached to them by an emotion like shame or guilt. If they think about doing something risky in the future, they feel linked to what might happen and may choose to do something different. The moments of their lives feel connected, each affecting the others, and all affecting their relationships with other people. How an immature sense of time limits self-reflection and accountability. Self-reflection is the ability to analyze your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors over time. People who focus mostly on the present moment don't have enough of a time perspective to engage in self-reflection. Instead, with each new moment, they leave their past behind, freeing them from any sense of responsibility for their actions. Therefore, when someone feels hurt by something they did in the past, they tend to accuse the person of dwelling on the past for no good reason. They don't understand why others can't just forgive, forget, and move on. Because of their limited sense of the continuity of time, they don't understand that it takes time to heal from a betrayal. You can see how hard accountability would be for these people. It's a flimsy concept for those who don't feel a temporal connection between their actions and future consequences. As a result, their natural style is to promise something, not do it, apologize perfunctorily, and then resent people if they keep bringing it up. You may wonder why a person would develop such an unreliable sense of time, being blind to their own inconsistencies and unable to observe their own behavior. It has to do with their lack of self-development and poor personality integration, along with their tendency toward extremely concrete, literal thinking, because they don't have an ongoing, continuous self as the organizing center of their personality. Emotions or stress can put them in a childlike mentality in which moments in time float separately. Summary: emotionally immature people have a poor sense of personal history and resist being accountable for their past actions or future consequences. Lacking a firm sense of self, they think family closeness means enmeshment, with people existing to mirror each other. Real communication is nearly impossible because of their poor empathy and rigid emphasis on roles. They neglect relationship repair and reciprocity and shirk the emotional work necessary to be sensitive to other people. Instead, they focus on whether others seem to make them look good or bad. Defending against anxiety trumps relating authentically to other people, including their children. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at some of the research on early mother-child attachment to see how these immature characteristics might arise. Then I'll discuss how this translates into 4 main types of emotionally immature parents. 4 types of emotionally immature parents. There are different types of emotionally immature parents, but all can cause loneliness and insecurity in children. There's basically one way to provide nurturing love, but many ways to frustrate a child's need for love. In this chapter, we'll look at 4 different types of parents, each with a particular brand of emotional immaturity. Although each type is emotionally insensitive in a different way, all create emotional insecurity in their children. Despite their different styles, all 4 types have the same underlying emotional immaturity. All tend to be self-involved, narcissistic, and emotionally unreliable. All share the common traits of egocentricity, insensitivity, and a limited capacity for genuine emotional intimacy. All use non-adaptive coping mechanisms that distort reality rather than dealing with it. And all use their children to try to make themselves feel better, often leading to a parent-child role reversal and exposing their children to adult issues in an overwhelming way. In addition, all 4 types have poor resonance with other people's feelings. They have extreme boundary problems, either getting too involved or refusing to get involved at all. Most tolerate frustration poorly and use emotional tactics or threats rather than verbal communication to get what they want. All 4 types of parents resist seeing their children as separate individuals and instead relate to them strictly on the basis of their own needs. And with all 4 styles, children end up feeling de-selfed because their needs and interests are eclipsed by what's important to their parents. Before we explore the 4 types, however, let's take a brief moment to look at previous research that studied the effects of different types of parenting on quality of attachment behavior in babies. How different types of parenting affect infant attachment. Mary Ainsworth, Sylvia Bell, and Donalda Straden conducted famous infant attachment research that has been replicated many times over the years. Part of their research involved observing and identifying maternal characteristics that were associated with either secure or insecure attachment behaviors in babies. As summarized in their 1974 article, these researchers rated mothers' behaviors toward their babies on 4 dimensions: sensitivity, insensitivity, acceptance, rejection, cooperation, interference, and accessible, ignoring. They found that a mother's degree of sensitivity was a key variable, in the sense that mothers who rated high in sensitivity also, without exception, rated high in acceptance, cooperation, and accessibility, whereas mothers who rated low in any one of the other 3 scales also rated low in sensitivity. Ainsworth and her colleagues reported that more sensitive mothers had babies who showed more secure attachment behaviors in their experiments. Here's how these researchers described the sensitive mothers of babies who showed secure attachment behaviors. In summary, highly sensitive mothers are usually accessible to their infants and are aware of even their more subtle communications, signals, wishes, and moods. In addition, these mothers accurately interpret their perceptions and show empathy with their infants. The sensitive mother, armed with this understanding and empathy, can time her interactions well and deal with her baby so that her interactions seem appropriate in kind as well as in quality, and prompt. However, the behaviors of mothers who had babies showing insecure attachment behaviors were very different. Thinking back to chapters 2 and 3 of this book, see if the following description of insensitive mothers from Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues reminds you of characteristics of what I am calling emotionally immature parents. In contrast, mothers with low sensitivity are not aware of much of their infant's behavior, either because they ignore the baby or they fail to perceive in his activity the more subtle and hard to detect communications. Furthermore, insensitive mothers often do not understand those aspects of their infant's behavior of which they are aware, or else they distort it. A mother may have somewhat accurate perceptions of her infant's activity and moods, but may be unable to empathize with him. Through either lack of understanding or empathy, mothers with low sensitivity improperly time their responses, either in terms of scheduling or in terms of promptness to the baby's communications. Further, mothers with low sensitivity often have inappropriate responses in kind as well as in quantity, i.e., interactions which are fragmented and poorly resolved. These research findings support the idea that a mother's levels of sensitivity and empathy strongly affect the quality of the baby's attachment behaviors in the mother-child relationship. The 4 types of emotionally immature parents. Keeping in mind this previous research on infant attachment, let's now take a look at what I've categorized as the 4 main types of emotionally immature parents, who are all especially likely to create feelings of insecurity in their children. Although each type undermines a child's emotional security in different ways, all of them relate to their children with limited empathy and unreliable emotional support, and their fundamental lack of sensitivity is the same. Also, be aware that each type exists along a continuum from mild to severe, with varying degrees of narcissism. In severe cases, the parent may be mentally ill or physically or sexually abusive.